Democracy is a precious thing, so precious that many will fight both figuratively and literally to defend it. In the past, some have even fought hard to gatekeep democracy, only allowing certain privileged individuals the right to participate in what they thought of as free and fair elections. For a template of democracy in the modern era, most people would probably point to the United States of America, but for most of that nation's existence, less than half the adult population was allowed to vote in open and fair elections. It wasn't until 1920 when women could finally vote for the president after the 19th Amendment had passed the year before. This game is a story of the movement that led to that amendment. This is Votes for Women, and you're watching What Does That Piece Do? Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in once again to What Does That Piece Do? My name is Joe, and today we've got a very special edition where I'll just be looking specifically at the history of a game. The game is Votes for Women. It's designed by Tory Brown. It was released by Fort Circle Games in 2022. So I'll be looking at the cards that are depicting the women that were specifically involved in the suffrage movement that led to the passing of the 19th Amendment in the United States. So normally I think you'd be counting on me for a bit of a teach of the game, but quite frankly, there's a lot of great teaching videos out there already. Namely, Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire. She does a great teaching video, as does Paula Denning from the How to Play crew. So go watch their videos. They're really great, really easy to get into this game with the help of them. That said, I think the rulebook's really well written. It's actually a very accessible game. It's not super complicated, but it's very engrossing, and like I say, very rich in history. Before I go on, don't forget to like and subscribe because I'm going to continue to do history-focused videos like this in the future, along with the teaching videos that I provide. And since it's International Women's History Month, as I'm recording this, I'd like to give a shout out to another woman who does amazing work on history podcasts. That's Dr. Mildred Strange. She's got her podcast called History for Misanthropes. Kind of covers the sort of dark side of history, the unknown little pockets of history that you might not have learned about in high school history class. So go check out her podcast. I was listening to some stuff recently on the Indian Rebellion against the British in 1857. I think the most recent podcast episode that she had, as of right now, is one on Hedy Lamarr, and she's getting very close to 100 episodes soon. So go check it out. Really cool view of history with Dr. Mildred Strange. Speaking of this game, there's a lot of great history in here. It's not just in the cards. There's actually a lot of supplemental material that you may have seen already that ships in the box. It's not necessarily needed to play the game, but really adds a lot of history flavor to it. For example, this New York Times reproduction of the front page of the New York Times the day after the amendment had passed. There's a lot of other stuff like this. And I'm going to show you more of that as we go through the game, as we look at some of the characters. Now, let's talk about the women of this movement. So this is a CDG, a card-driven game. So there's lots of cards here. You could be playing as the suffragists. If you're playing at all, there's going to be at least one player playing as the suffragists. You can play co-op as both suffragists. Players, you could be playing the opposition to if you wanted to battle back. Otherwise, there's an opposition bot that you could be playing against. But there's tons of different events, movements, organizations. There's a lot of great stuff here. So I'm going to go through the women of history, the women of the suffrage movement that was this very rich history that went from 1850 right up to 1920. I got 70 years worth of history right in this box. So the game is divided into early, middle, and late decks. I'm going to try and go through this as chronologically as possible, basically focusing on the year that these women were born in particular. So without further ado, let's take a look at the women that made up the suffrage movement that helped pass the 19th Amendment. Okay, so the first card we're going to look at here is the card for Sojourner Truth. She was born in 1797. Originally, her name was Isabella Baumfree. She was born into slavery, but she escaped with her daughter to freedom in 1826. But she still had a son that was held as a slave, so she was able to sue and get her son back in 1828. This was the first ever court case in the United States of a black woman was victorious against a white man to get custody of one of her children back. So, very pivotal moment for her. She changed her name in 1843 to Sojourner Truth. She got more and more involved in abolitionism and the women's rights movement. She was not involved in any one voting rights org, but she implored the white activists that were fighting for women's suffrage at the time to include black women as part of their fight. She gave the Ain't I a Woman speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851. And in fact, there's a reproduction of the anti-slavery bugle here in the box that actually captures some of the essence of her speech. Now, I think it was after the fact, and this man, was going off of memory, and he injected a little bit of Southern dialect into this. That really wasn't the way that Sojourner Truth necessarily spoke. I mean, she was born speaking Dutch, and she learned English along the way, so she didn't quite have the Southern drawl that was injected in there, but nevertheless, this was huge and pivotal and really inspired a lot of black women, especially, to get involved in suffrage and really sort of drove that intersectionality that we're going to see all throughout this history here. So she had famously said, if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women and it will be just as bad as it was before. So she was very crucial, making sure that all women were involved, as many women as possible were involved in this movement for women's suffrage. Next up, we have Lucy Stone. She was born in 1818. She was a famous orator, an abolitionist, and really pivotal in women's suffrage. She continued to use her birth name after her marriage, which was very uncommon at that time, and it's still pretty uncommon today. She organized the first ever Women's National Rights Convention in 1850. She was involved in the Women's National Loyal League, and she helped pass the 13th Amendment. So remember, she's an abolitionist as well. You're going to see a lot of this. You're going to see a lot of trends for these women throughout the suffrage movement as we go through this. She formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and she would have inspired the likes of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Those are names you probably already recognize. So those three, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were essentially the triumvirate of women's suffrage in the 19th century in the U.S. So, speaking of Susan B. Anthony, she doesn't get her own card necessarily herself, but her indictment does. She was indicted for trying to vote in 1872. A lot of other women tried to vote. They were arrested at the time too, but they were all released except for Susan B. Anthony, pending her trial to see what happened there. And leading up to the trial, she gave a lot of speeches throughout Monroe County in New York. Her speech was entitled, "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" She said, "We no longer petition legislature or Congress to give us the right to vote. We appeal to women everywhere to exercise their too long neglected citizens' right to vote." So big emphasis on, hey, women are citizens. They should have the right to vote. Women, get out there and vote. So her trial, it started in June 1873, and she gave very impassioned speeches along the way, talking over the judge. This judge wouldn't let her have a proper trial by jury, which, well, she probably wouldn't have accepted anyway, because those juries did not include women. So she wanted a trial by her peers, if anything, but her peers were not invited to be part of the trial and judge her accordingly. Ultimately, though, she was sentenced to pay a fine of $100 US. So in today's money, that would be about $2,300 US. She refused to pay it. And the judge, he could have jailed her, but at which point she would have been taken all the way to the Supreme Court, but the judge didn't want to do that. So she was charged, she was fined, she never paid. And also you'll find among the documents in the box a reproduction of her indictment document as well too, just to add a little bit more of contextual history flavor for you there. And next up we have Frances Harper. She was born in 1825, again an abolitionist, a suffragist, a poet, and a temperance activist as well too. She's one of the first African American women to be published in the U.S. She worked as a teacher in Columbus, Ohio. She helped free slaves and joined the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1853. As she got more and more involved with women's suffrage, she championed this intersectionality, speaking up for black women when their voices were being drowned out at the other women's rights conventions. In 1866, at the Women's National Rights Convention in New York City, she said, While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America. So here she is challenging the white women that are predominantly leading the suffragist movement in the United States to, kind of open their eyes and see who else is being left behind. And then out of that, with the guidance of Harper, the American Equal Rights Association was formed. So that's the AERA. So some of the suffragists within that movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they didn't support the 15th Amendment's aim to enfranchise black men without extending suffrage rights to women. Then Harper, on the other hand, she supported the 15th Amendment and endorsed the amendment at their final meeting. And shortly afterwards, that's where the split starts to happen. You see the split in these groups between the National Women's Suffrage Association, which did not support the amendment, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported the amendment. A few things happening here, 15th Amendment to allow black men to vote, but they're trying to get women attached to it, and it was kind of an all or nothing cause for one of the groups, and the other group was going in a different direction. So you see the split, and that's kind of represented in the game also by those little pawns, little purple and yellow pawns, to show they were fighting for the same goal ultimately, but they have different ways and means of getting there, and different ideas of how that was going to be achieved. So far, I've been talking about women that supported the suffrage movement in the United States. They're part of the suffrage deck, but there are also some women figures that show up in the opposition deck. So I'll start with one here, Catherine Beecher. She was born in 1800. She was the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, she was progressive in some areas. She opposed the Indian Removal Bill. This was the bill that was literally had Native Americans being moved and mandated by the government to be moved out of their land to make room for other Americans, right? So she was opposed to that, so progressive in those areas, but she was ultimately opposed to suffrage. She thought women would be corrupted by politics and really should stick to being mothers and teachers. So she's not the only one, but that's one that shows up in the opposition deck against women's suffrage. Back now to women that are supporting the movement, we've got Anna Dickinson. She was born in 1842. She is a Quaker. She was an orator and lecturer. She was the first woman to give a political address before U.S. Congress. She was an abolitionist and a feminist as well. She worked on the campaign in 1863 for pro-Union Republicans. They were supporting the anti-slavery movement. She went and she spoke and lectured to many injured soldiers on the Union side in the Civil War. She became known as the Joan of Arc of the U.S. Civil War, actually. She was very gifted at giving speeches. She would hold thousands of people in the palm of her hand for hours at a time giving these speeches. Made a lot of money doing it too. She was making about $20,000 US a year, and the money at that time, that's like $500,000 now a year giving speeches. So she was very popular. But she gave a lot of that money away to friends and family and to charities as well. So she wasn't officially in any of the suffragist groups necessarily, but she did speak a lot on women's rights and the rights to vote. And then now we're starting to move into the middle deck as we're getting closer and closer to that time where the 19th Amendment is actually tabled and passed, and a lot of the events leading up to that. The first woman that I'll call out in the middle deck, though, she's actually a British citizen, Emmeline Pankhurst. She's born in 1858, British suffragist, and the British were very hardcore at this. There is footage that you can go see of a woman stepping out onto a racetrack during a horse race to protest women's rights to vote in the UK. As you can imagine, that does not end well at all, but they were putting their lives and bodies on the lines to protest this. So Emmeline was really kind of a leader of that movement in the UK. She came over to the US and she was going to speak to women in the US that were fighting for the same rights there at the time. There were a lot of people opposed to that. In fact, there were folks writing letters. We've got some letters here, are the reproductions in the box, including one from the Standard Guano Company that did not want Emmeline Pankhurst coming to the United States to speak on behalf of women's suffrage. She was that big of a threat, so they wanted to see that she wasn't either let into the country, she kicked out back to the UK, or wasn't allowed to speak. So very important figure. Even though she's from the UK, she really kind of helped inspire the women in the US at the time. And now back to the Americans. Here's an American name you might recognize. This is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She was born in 1862. She was born into slavery, but she was freed by the Emancipation Act. She was a teacher and a journalist. She focused on documenting the white racist terror that was happening in the South at the time. And she was very focused on lynchings that were happening, that were very prominent, and making sure that other journalists would speak up about this too. The fact that she kept speaking up so vehemently for black women unfortunately put her at odds with some of the white women that were leading the movement at the time, including a Frances Willard. She also appears in the deck. Wells called out Willard for being silent on lynching. They were both touring the UK at the time, and Ida B. Wells is speaking very, very vocally about lynching and what was actually going on in America, and she felt it was being ignored by Willard, so she penned an article called Miss Willard's Attitude in a paper called The Red Record to call that out. So, she was definitely ruffling a lot of feathers, but getting a lot of attention to make sure that black emancipation and black rights were being respected and observed along with the suffrage movement. And then now we were starting to see some Native American representation in the game with Mary Louise Batino Baldwin. She was born in 1863, a Métis that was from the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa Nation. She was the first Native American woman to graduate from the Washington College of Law. She was a suffragist that fought for women's rights in North Dakota, but she really wanted to fight to dismantle the stereotypical image of the squaw woman of natives that was held by a lot of whites at the time, including white suffragists. She was part of that march, that parade on Washington in 1913. Originally, the organizers were trying to get her to ride on a float that was kind of like stereotypical Native American type set up to sort of separate her and elevate, give this sort of Native mythos around her showing up there. But she just wanted to march. She wanted to march and be part of it. She wore her full regalia and everything, but she wanted to march alongside the women, didn't want to be sort of tokenized up on this float. So very pivotal in the movement as well. And then now we have another woman that's part of the opposition side, another name you might recognize, Emma Goldman. She was born in 1869. She was an anarcho-feminist. She was hostile to this wave of suffragist feminism. Being an anarchist, she thought the act of voting really kind of validated the system and the state that she wanted to see upended and dismantled. So she's like, why would women want to do that? Voting is a waste of time. She wrote some essays. In 1910, an essay she wrote, Women's Suffrage. She referred to universal suffrage as a modern fetish. Just thought people were too obsessed with it, that women were saying like, oh, we're going to come in and purify politics just by our nature, which she thought was false too. So anyway, this, the whole idea of voting really went counter to her views, so she's really no help at all. And actually, in fact, when I was playing the game and her card came up and is part of the Oppobot against me, I thought I was doing really well, and she dismantled a bunch of stuff. I said, damn it, Emma, I was rooting for you. Why do you want to hurt us like this? But anyway, there she is, part of the opposition. But anyway, let's get back to the supporters here. The next card we have is Zitkala-Sa. She's another Native American woman. She was born in 1876, part of the Lakota Nation. She was an advocate for preserving the Native American way of life. She was part of what was called the Society of American Indians. She lobbied for the right for full citizenship for Native Americans. And it was a goal that was kind of criticized by other indigenous activists. Again, kind of like the Emma Goldman thing, like they did not want to validate this state that was superimposed by the colonizers. They thought they wanted to rip themselves out of that in certain areas, but there were people that did want to be, make sure they were part of the political process, whether it was allowed to be politicians or the right to vote. So that's what Zitkala was fighting for. She was the secretary of the SAI then, that's the Society of American Indians, and she lobbied against the boarding schools that at the time they were, taking Native American kids from their families and not allowing them to speak their language or practice their culture. So, stripping the native out of the native child. This is a practice that happened a lot throughout North America in the residential schools in Canada as well too. So this is something that she fought hard against as a Native American rights activist. And now we have a card that actually represents two women, two very important women, but they kind of go hand in hand here. We've got Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. So Alice Paul was born in 1885, Lucy Burns in 1879. They formed the National Women's Party, which was arguably more militant than any other suffragist groups at the time in the US. Lucy Burns, for example, she was really inspired by the UK suffrage movement, which, as I mentioned earlier, they were hardcore. So Pankhurst and her crew, so they saw some of the stuff that they were doing that was getting a lot of eyes and a lot of attention. They kind of wanted to emulate some of that. Then Alice Paul, she was using like non-violent resistance type of methods that really got her arrested and had her suffering at the hands of police brutality anyway. So she ended up thrown in jail a lot. These two together, they would help organize the 1913 Women's Parade on Washington. It was meant to take place the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So they're very pivotal in this. You're going to hear more about this in a little bit. But even after that, then Alice Paul, she would go on to organize something called the Silent Sentinels. So these are a group of protesters, women that were standing outside of Woodrow Wilson's White House, in 1917. So you had this one march in 1913. It's still 1917. 4 years later, they're still protesting that same president to do something. Here's another name you'll probably recognize: Helen Keller. She was born in 1880. She's a well-known disability activist. She lost her sight and hearing, and you've probably heard the story about her being able to learn how to communicate again, the Miracle Worker movie. I remember seeing that one in high school and learning all about her at the time. So you probably know quite a bit about her, but hey, did you know she was part of the suffragist movement? And actually, she was a socialist as well, too, member of the Socialist Party. So she was involved in the movement and was in the 1913 parade on Washington. She championed for civil rights. She spoke out against racism. She believed that the poor were ground down by industrial oppression. She wanted children born into poor families to have the same opportunities to succeed that she had enjoyed. She wrote, "I owed my success partly to the advantages of my birth and environment. I've learned that the power to rise is not within everyone's reach." So you can see this is why she's part of the Socialist Party, really trying to rise everyone up along with her and make sure that they had the same advantages and opportunities. It's not all a great story, though. In 1915, she was expressing support for eugenics, in favor of, letting disabled, mentally ill infants die or not have medical assistance to keep them alive. So this is kind of popular at the time. Unfortunately, more and more people talking about that, concerns about overpopulation and should these folks just be allowed to die. And unfortunately, that conversation keeps rearing its ugly head, and it looks like Helen Keller got caught up in it. Apparently she did maybe retract some of these comments and attitudes later in life. It's kind of hard to pin down exactly what all she said, but it just goes to show how pervasive some of these ideologies were. And up next, we're starting to see some Latin American representation here as well. Maria de Lopez, born in 1881, she was based in California. She translated a lot of the suffragist docs to Spanish for the women there, Latin American women, so that they can read and understand what was going on with potentially their right to vote as well. So she was involved in the College of Equal Suffrage League of Southern California, where suffrage was actually passed in 1911. So she did a lot of great groundwork to really get things running and passing at the state level in California. She continued to campaign even after that for universal suffrage, and she was even published in the LA Herald with a lot of her articles and her opinions on it. She was invited to that 1913 parade, but it's unknown whether she was able to actually attend that. But very big figure in California women's movement. And the final card we'll look at in the middle era deck is Inez Millholland. She espoused a socialist platform and worldview, and a lot of her speeches that she gave. She thought women's voting rights would clean up the nation, right? So again, that idea that, hey, let women in and they're going to clean things up for sure. But she was a very prominent voice in the women's suffrage movement, leading right up to the 1913 parade. And in fact, she was highly featured in that parade. In the 1913 parade, she was clad in all white, riding a white horse, leading that parade. The pictures of her are iconic from that parade. All the pictures from that parade just look amazing, and what an event it would have been for sure. But she was kind of the face of that parade, and a lot of women would have looked up to her. Sadly, though, she did not live to see the 19th Amendment pass. It was just a few years later, but in 1916, She was on tour in the western US, and she suffered from pernicious anemia, which is basically a vitamin B deficiency, which meant that she was not producing enough red blood cells. And some of her family and friends told her, like, you got to slow down, you got to take time out for your health, but she wanted to press on. And then she ended up collapsing on stage in the middle of a speech when in Los Angeles. They rushed her to the hospital to try to treat her, give her blood transfusions, but unfortunately she died a month later. This is someone that literally died for the cause and ultimately didn't get to see the fruits of her labor when the 19th Amendment finally passed. So that's Inez Millholland. But now we move into the late era, so you're going to see some of the women that are involved in that final steps of the 19th Amendment passing, and even beyond that in fighting for more women's rights. So starting with Mary Church Tyrell. She was born in 1863. She is among the first African-American women to earn a college degree. She was an educator. She served on school boards, a first in many of the school boards that she served on. She's a member of the NAWSA, where she saw the need to create organizations for black women's voting rights. So again, not seeing black women properly represented in some of these organizations. She was one of the few black members of that org that was allowed to speak, actually. Since the NAWSA didn't allow for a black women's chapter, she fought to have that changed and fought to create other groups beyond that. In the 1913 parade, Alice Paul wasn't originally going to allow for black women to march and maybe, have them not march with the white women, but march in the back of the parade. What a great symbolic gesture that would have been. There's mixed reporting, though, on whether that went down. Mary Church Tyrell definitely was speaking out against that and saying, no, we all need to march together. Different sources give different accounts of, what really happened. The parade, though, along the way, there's a lot of security issues with properly corralling it through the city in Washington. So chances are a lot of people got mixed up in that anyway. So it's not exactly 100% clear on how it all went down and how they all marched together at the beginning. But you can rest assured Mary Church was a big voice there fighting for black women to be part of the entire parade. And then we've got Mary McLeod Bethune. She was born in 1871. She was an educator and activist. She served as the Florida chapter president of the National Association of Colored Women from 1917 to 1925. She did a lot of work to get black women out to vote once they finally did get that right to vote. She was an advisor even to Franklin Roosevelt. She founded something called the National Association of Negro Women in 1935, and her educational legacy lives on. Actually, there's a bunch of schools named after her all throughout the U.S., including the Bethune-Cookman University. It's a historically black university in Florida, so her legacy lives on. And finally, the last card we'll look at here is Dr. Mabel Ping Lo Ali. She was born in 1896, and she was the first Chinese woman in the U.S. to earn a doctorate in economics. She championed women's suffrage and rode on horseback in the 1912 New York City women's suffrage parade. She was only 15 years old at the time, and then she was writing letters and articles in her student union, student groups along the way. Even at a very young age, as a teenager, she was contributing to the movement then. After the 19th Amendment was passed, though, she could still not vote because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So here you see this vote passed, and finally women have the ability to vote in the presidential elections, but not all women. It wasn't until 1943 that she was finally able to vote. So there you have it. There's a good sample of the cards in this game, the ones that specifically reference women. There's tons of other ones beyond that. There's event cards. There's other cards about the organizations themselves and in certain movements and factors, both on the opposition and on the support side. I didn't tell you about how these cards actually affect the game, so you're going to have to find out for yourself, really, once you play the game, if you haven't had a chance to already. All the cards are amazing. The art's amazing. The gameplay is really fast and smooth. Like I said, it's not a huge barrier to get into this game. You don't have to really know really heavy political games that much to be able to get into this. The rulebook's really well written. There's lots of great videos out there as well to teach you how to play and make sure you're doing it right. So I do hope you get a chance to enjoy it. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more, let me know. Sound off in the comments. Maybe we'll just be doing some more history-specific videos in the future. But until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you at the table someday. Cheers.